Our first speaker this afternoon is Mary McAuliffe, who's a historian, Director of Gender Studies in UCD. She's been very heavily involved in the decade of centenaries, and among her extensive list of publications is a biography of the feminist and revolutionary woman Margaret Skinner. So this afternoon, her paper is entitled Using the Archives to Write the Histories of Queer Female Sexualities in Ireland. So over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, and it was a wonderful session this morning, and of course, what would us consultants or historians be without the custodians and those who bring those archives together and make them accessible. As Colin said, I was very much involved in the decade of centenaries, and while a lot of the material I looked at was to do with the experiences, contributions, legacies, traumas, impacts of the work of militant women, of suffrage women, of political women, as I was doing that, I began to see other histories that were calling out to be looked at and that are emerging from those archives. And I think it's very important to talk about these today. And in her book, An Archive of Feeling, Trauma, Sexuality and Lesbian Public Culture, Anne Vetkovich argued that queer archives address particular versions of the determination to never forget that gives the archives of these histories their urgency. And as she wrote, that gay and lesbian history even exists has been a contested fact, and the struggle to record and preserve it is exacerbated by the invisibility that often surrounds intimate life, especially sexuality. Even the relatively short history, roughly 100 years, of homosexuality as a defined category has created the historiographical challenge of not only documenting wide varieties of homosexual experience, but examining documents of homophobia along with earlier histories of homoeroticism and same-sex relationships. And so while I'm not talking about the broader history of homosexuality, male and female and trans histories, etc., I want to look at queer female histories and archives that are spoken about by people like Marta Visinkas, Joan Scott, Joan Nessel, Laura Doan, among others, who have helped define, complicate, and elaborate on the difficulties of historicizing the lesbian, or even defining what the lesbian is. As Visinkas said, the lesbian is a popular subject for scrutiny. She exists, but how do we define her history? Who do we include? How do we find her in the archives? Where to begin? And so, I think it was Barry this morning said about we have to keep asking why and when and where and question the archives. In Ireland, there is quite a bit of research, much of it, I must say, by literary scholars, that has concentrated on what we would call romantic friendships, homosocial groups or female couples in so-called Boston marriages, as defined by Carl Smith Rosenberg in her famous article, Female Love and Friendship in 19th Century America. Couples who fit this type would be the 18th century couple, the ladies of Llangolan, everyone pronounces that in a different way, and from the 19th century couples such as Somerville and Ross. However, a recent biographer of Somerville and Ross argues that while, and I quote, the erotic potential of the bond between the women should be foregrounded, but she sought neither to promote or deny, and I quote, the possibilities of lesbian attachment, and thus avoided the empirical investigations of sexuality, which she argues have consistently marred critical attempts to explicate the nature of Somerville and Ross's authorial and sentimental bond. However, I would argue that actually the authorial and sentimental bonds between the couple absolutely need to be looked at, and we do need to, as much as we can, establish the nature of their relationship. This is one of the, I suppose, obstacles, is that people sometimes say, well, do we really need to know this? And these historical challenges are central to the writing of sexuality. And for example, women I've written on at the moment, the Irish revolutionary women who were in female same-sex relationships. We need to include looking beyond a heteronormative history, which would, as Judith Butler has written, include re-looking at the history of single women and of how they're often depicted in the archives through a heteronormative lens, pathetic, sexless, lonely failures in the game of heterosexual courtship and marriage. And as Bennett says, the phrase usually in their biographies is, "she never married," which is often used as a cover-up or a cover-all in discussing intimacy and relationship of women in non-heterosexual relationships or perceived to be single. Bennett also argues that looking through the archives for and at single women, both heterosexual and lesbian, who could have had rich lives, means that we sometimes write their lives that are devoid of sexual possibility and emotional richness, and that is a pity. Laura Doan further argues that we need to be careful in presentism in our research and the lens that we use if we construct these histories of modern sexuality around individuals who self-define. So do we go to the archive looking for somebody who says, "I fancied Mary down the road"? You know, we can't self-define these in our modern terms. We have to look at them in the terms in which they define themselves. Otherwise, those histories will be limited and skewed. What about all those women who lived private lives with other women but never self-defined or perceived their identity or sexuality as a thing apart? It was just who they were and what they did. There is only a need to clarify, as Doan argues, the possibility or the suggestibility of sapphism as it appears in the archives and to speculate on what that means. For instance, one couple who have been studied and brilliantly, I think, in Sonia Tiernan's biography of Eva Gore-Booth are the couple Eva Gore-Booth and Esther Roper, who the first biographer of Eva Gore-Booth and Esther Roper, from letters Sonia uncovered in the archives, was determined to disprove their relationship and wrote to Jocelyn Gore-Booth saying she could find nothing that would suggest that they were a couple in the archives. Sonia has obviously overcome that. But we could also look at the magazine they founded, Urania. Along with Irene Clyde, also known as Thomas Batty, a transgender lawyer and scholar, they founded Urania in 1916, and according to Tiernan, challenged mainstream feminism's medical sexology and society's gender norms, and it was a radical challenge to the system of presumed heterosexuality and portrayed female same-sex relationships as superior to all other relationships. So, you know, we keep even with couples that are, or women that are established in the archives and written about, we need to keep going back to their archives as well. We have to understand that lesbian history and queer femininities are not separate from or isolated within women's and gender history or the histories of sexualities. Sorry, there's Urania. According to its statement of intent, there are no men and women in Urania, and what follows over the next 20 years of its publication is a collection of articles from across the world that seek to determine stereotypes and promote the abolition of gender. I just want to show you this about going into the archives. I did this when I was researching for the documentary that was really recently shown on TG Cahir, Criha Radica, or Radical Hearts, the same-sex women of the revolutionary movement. And this is a love letter between two women that's in the National Archives in Ireland. Margaret Chevenot-Trench, cultural nationalist, part of that, a big family of cultural nationalists, and a love letter from Judy Withers, who I cannot find. We know she was in Ireland in 1916 and 17, was an artist. There's some sketches of hers in the National Gallery. It's on their archive. I have tried everywhere in England to find her, so if anyone finds her, please let me know. So these lesbian histories need to be considered within women's history, because questions of family, of childbearing and rearing, of class, of race, of politics, as well as revolutions and radical politics arise, which means that historians also need to consider the way in which lesbian sexuality intersected with the lived categories of ethnicity, of class, of gender, etc., etc. As Sue Morgan argues, historical lesbian watching, privileging the visual, has given way more recently to a more open-ended, fluid understanding of female sexual subjectivity. And while historical challenges emanating from these historical identities are there, the ambivalence to historical evidence and authorial intention remain. The most provocative challenge is to deconstruct the hidden meanings of historical silences and omissions in the archives that characterises so much of lesbian history. For the historian, archival research on LGBT or queer histories use many of the same archives, special collections, manuscripts, newspapers, memoirs, diaries, and personal papers, etc., to research homosexual subjects. I was able to rewrite Margaret Skinner's relationship with Nora O'Keeffe through looking at letters in the Sheehy Skeffington archive. So all of these appear in these archives. And again, as Chet Vetkovich noted, archives with queer possibilities embody a passion for the radical potential of the counter-archives, but also offers a critique of archives and archival practices, even as they are informed by the haunting archival absences that accompany the documentation of histories of violence, sexualities, and oppression. She noted that many times queer material becomes ephemera in the archives, the term used by archivists and librarians to describe occasional publications, paper documents, material objects, and items that fall into the miscellaneous category that is being catalogued. These ephemera and more mainstream materials, photographs and letters, court documents, land documents, obituaries, wills, etc., all have queer potential and connect incidences in narratives to help us reconstruct a particular queer experience. However, taking a queer lens allows the researcher to interrogate ways in which LGBTI+ histories appear in the archive, everything from how queer is represented in the archives. We have, of course, the Irish Queer Archive in the National Library of Ireland, but we also need to look at other archives. We can't just be, keeping our view on archives that are entitled queer. The other archives have that potential as well. So, and also the word queer doesn't appear in everything. So there are different ways in which contemporary meanings of the word are not used in archives that are older, but they do show potential to write LGBT lives. And we have to change our understandings of the histories of sexuality and expand our knowledge of hidden and marginalised history. So for the rest of this talk, I want to look at a number of areas that I've been doing research on. One of them, of course, is the revolutionary women. And myself and Harriet Wheelock of the Royal College of Physicians, the archivist there, recently published the diaries of Kathleen Lynn, which cover her life from 1916. One of her first entries is Easter Monday 1916, the first word, revolution. What a way to start a diary. And she keeps a daily diary until a couple of months before she dies in 1955, over 1 million words. It covers everything: St. Ultan's, revolutionary movement, Irish Free State and its treatment of women, her work as part of bringing new and innovative medical practices to St. Ultan's, etc. But central to the diary is the relationship with Madeleine French-Mullen, whom I photographed there. Just to give you an example, 1921, 28th of January, very mild, Madeleine, grüßt me as the clock struck last night. That was on the night of Madeleine's birthday. Interestingly, both Lynn and French-Mullen in their writings use German words to express heightened emotions. These and much else is the stuff of a shared life. The entry, as I said there, talks about grüßt. Marie Mulholland, who has written on the relationship, suggests this comes from the German word grüßen, to greet, a language and indeed a country both women had knowledge and affinity for. She, and I agree with her, suggests this is a covert word, and indeed the use of this word for what passed between the women as the clock struck, and its hidden to us meaning, is not uncommon in the diaries of same-sex relationships. They often hide emotion under code words or different languages. However, I'll move on from Lynn and French-Mullen to talk about the other revolutionary women whom I haven't written of yet. Before I go, though, I am using the diaries of Rosamund Jacobs to go deeper into the relationship between French-Mullen and Lynn. And a couple of days ago, on Monday, the 8th of February 1909, I was looking at that entry, and it's the first day that Rosamund meets Madeleine French-Mullen. And she says she was a rather small, pretty little person with black hair and bright eyes like a bird and a rather big nose. rather like Miss O'Neill Walsh in figure and rather like her brother, Douglas French Mullen, in face. And she goes on to talk about, and they become very good friends. So now I'm going to read on forward, because in 1917, Jacob has an entry where she recounts a conversation with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington about sex. Hannah was now widowed. She said she was glad to be over with all of that. And then they mention that Dr. Lynn and Madeline have no use for men at all. So it is in the conversation about sex that they mention that the two women who are living together at this stage have no use for men. So I want to track the relationship between 1909 and 1917, because we don't know exactly when Lynn and French Mullen meet. It's sometime around 1912, 1913. And I hope that Jacob references that or has some commentary to make on that. Other ways of finding these women is using death notices and obituaries, and I will show you gravestones. Death of Elizabeth O'Farrell, the death notice shows that the relatives and lifelong partner of the late Nurse O'Farrell of 22 Lower Mann Street. The chief mourners were Miss Sheila Julia Grennan. This is the space where the widow or widower would be of a heterosexual couple. Then the story of the grave. They're buried together near the Republican plot in Glasnevin. Elizabeth was not buried there initially. She was buried at a far distant corner of Glasnevin. Julia bought this grave, got her exhumed, and brought her back to near the Republican plot, and then left a space for herself at the bottom, where when she died herself, she was buried there under the inscription, "And her lifelong comrade and friend, Sheila Julia Grennan." An interview with Julia Grennan in 1972 from Ita Mallon of the Evening Herald. She says she was 83 then, living alone in the flat in Lower Mann Street, where she and her Lizzie had shared for over half a century. The flat has become for Julia both a home and a shrine, not a marble place for mourning, though mentions of Nurse O'Farrell brought the ready tears, but a place where she could relive the memory of all that they had done together, the good times and the bad, the tours in Ireland, the holidays in Rome, and of course, the Rising. And there is the actual gravestone itself. When dealing with Margaret Skinner, obviously she had written about her experiences in the Rising and the way she dressed for the Rising. This is the original photograph of the famous photograph which appears in Doing My Bit for Ireland. This is 1915, when she's dressed passing as a Fina boy up the Dublin mountains, obviously with two young ladies on her arms. When it is published in Doing My Bit for Ireland in 1917, it is obviously appears with the two girls are now a hedge on either side of Skinner. Is this an early example of, kind of de-queering a photograph? And I think, that is a question we have to ask. All of these, as in doing my research, these people spent their lives together. Even in the diaries, it can be a hidden relationship with the word Gruce. In Britain and the US, and indeed to a lesser degree here, as Wendy Rouse writes of US activists, the popular press often mocked these women. Suffragettes were mannish women. Anti-suffragettes used this caricature and its suggestion of lesbianism to delegitimize the activism of these women. And in particular for revolutionary women, their militancy was suspect, especially when the majority of these women were anti-treaty. As Jenny Gould has argued in Britain, people drew links between displays of militarism and masculine women, feminism and lesbianism. And we certainly know the anxieties around gun women and bloodthirsty Amazons were rife post-Civil War in the Irish Free State. So these women often did challenge the narrative and had lifelong, life-affirming relationships with other women, both in their subversion of the heterosexual, heteronormative expectation and performance, and the radical potential and space the partnerships offered these political women. Again, as Tiernan said on Eva Gore Booth, Eva's sexuality appears to have a profound influence on her writings. To ignore this aspect of her life results in misreading her poetry, plays, and philosophical prose. Eva's relationship with Esther was intense, passionate, and uncompromising. Their lives centre on one another. My research in the archives to date looks at the revolutionary and early Irish Free State women, And it has demonstrated the existence of histories of queer women. Now, they are the political women. Obviously, it's much harder to find ordinary women, and particularly working class women, because they leave very little evidence in the archives. But I'm not saying it's impossible. And as we heard this morning, there are so many archives out there that are not properly catalogued that we need to go and research. And it would be great if we were just paid to do that all day long. I would suggest there are ways and means of getting around that, though, and we need to broaden the idea of what is the archive. And just to give you an example or two, in researching Nell Humphreys and Anna O'Rahilly, sisters of the O'Rahilly, and Nell's daughter Sheila Humphreys as members of Cumann na mBan, I was looking back into their history, and I came across this reference to Margaret Rahilly, who actually is the founder of the O'Rahilly fortune in the business in North Kerry, and the fact that she spent her life with a woman called Anne O'Donnell. They lived in Ballylongford, North Kerry, for 40 years with one another. She lived with another old maid, Miss O'Donnell again, the phraseology, spinster, old maid, etc., etc. Margaret Rahilly died on the 2nd of April 1877, aged 78, and she's buried in nearby Lislochton Abbey. Anne O'Donnell died shortly after that, in the 2nd of June 1877, although in the will of Margaret Rahilly, she was left the house as a lifelong residence, and then it went back into the O'Rahilly family. They are buried together at Lislochton Abbey. The inscription on their gravestone reads, "In life they were united, in death they are not separated." That to me suggests a queer relationship of some sort. And so this is only the beginning of this broader aspect of the research I want to do. When I was researching Margaret Skinner, her father came from just outside Monaghan town in County Monaghan, and his ancestors had been tenants on the Rose Estate in Tydedevitt in County Monaghan. The last Rose that had to deal was Miss Gertrude Rose, and I was looking into her papers, found an article, and at the end it just said a brief mention of her companion, Ephemy Matilda Foster, who died in October 1893. In the pink memorial to Gertrude Rose in St. Timothy's Church of Ireland in Ballinode, the inscription reads, Gertrude Rose died 26th February, born 26th February 1928, died 1907. And on the left side of that, Ephany Maria Foster, and when she was born and died, and the inscription reads, God deeply regretted, the much-loved companion of Gertrude Rose, deeply regretted. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. I would argue that these are not just best friends. There is a relationship between these two women. How we read this relationship has to be beyond the heteronormative ideas of relationship. So my research is building on that of other scholars who've uncovered a number of relationships, and I would suggest to you that we have a rich existing history of same-sex relationship among women, among political and radicalized women, among ordinary women, among gender non-conforming women, lesbian, bi, trans, or queer, whatever words you wish to use. And we need to keep uncovering that relationship. When we look for it, the histories are already there in the archives and published documents, in material culture and in artifacts, and I think we have to go beyond established archives and see that, as with all women's histories, archives need to be broadened out, and what we consider the archive has to be broadened out. As Vysenkits puts it so memorably, the possibilities of the not said and the not seen as conceptual tools for writing history are powerful. She further notes, lesbian history is a powerful example of history written for compelling moral reasons. And in quoting Barbara Smith, she said, we researched and wrote so each of us would not only know better how to live, but how to dream. We believed profoundly that ideas mattered, that histories could change lives because it changed ours. Faced with a fierce backlash against homosexual rights, this history has now become even more necessary today. The absence of lesbian histories and concerns from our archives is a powerful way of ensuring women, particularly lesbian women, continue to be deprived of a rich and satisfying history. And this can be part of the exclusion and marginalisation generally of LGBTI history. I hope my research and that of others goes some way in providing a corrective to that. Thank you very much.